so many great resources, just kind of like what you guys are seeing right now. But the On Hands program that I'm pretty sure Faith can talk about, Cronkite News, how it's really it's what you're going to be doing eventually when you graduate. So that's why Cronkite is amazing. That's biased, but I can tell you for a fact that the things that you learn in school are things that you're going to apply in the real world. That's what you're going to apply when you're going out there and become what you want to be eventually. So that's basically my summary. And right now, what I am is a digital content producer for Univision Arizona. We are a Spanish media, but there are a lot of lack of resources for our Hispanic community, especially here in Arizona, where we are a border state. Definitely dealing with the pandemic and what information is available, what resources are available. That's where journalists come in and kind of explain and break down what things mean and the importance of interviewing, because there's one thing of asking questions, but really understanding certain things and helping that reach to our audience in many ways, regardless of language. But having that content and that help available for our community is inevitably what we're here for.
Definitely, yeah. It's important to have these conversations and remember that when you're talking to someone, even though now it may be over Zoom, there is a person on the other side. So kind of just getting to know them. And we're talking about interviewing like a pro, and sometimes you will get assigned stories or breaking news that will happen or things that you get assigned that morning and it's ready to be turned in later in the show. You kind of have to educate yourself really quickly on what this topic is, what the bill that's going to be passed, whatever the story may be. You kind of have to quickly educate yourself on what's going on to be able to interview a variety of people to get this story done. So it is super important, even if you don't feel confident on what you're going to cover that day, to educate yourself as much as possible. Talk to a variety of diverse, different sources that you can get all points of views. Always try to get every viewpoint that you can. It's just super important to have a well-rounded story. And since the pandemic, I know a lot of people, when it came to Zoom, it's like, how am I supposed to be a pro at Zoom? This is all very new. But I think what I've learned is that you still have to remember, like I said before, there is a human person on the other side. It's not just a recording. You're talking to someone. So be very present when you're talking to them. And it's okay to acknowledge and have comments and reply back to what they're saying. You want to make sure it feels like a conversation and that they feel comfortable talking to you, because for a lot of people, they might be doing their very first interview with you. And if you're in person interviewing, it's the first time they've had a camera maybe in their face. So just making them feel comfortable and confident, I think is super important. And when you're selecting sources, you want to make sure you're being diverse and you're making sure you're letting a lot of voices be heard, not just a certain selection of people. You want to make sure that you get a well-rounded story. So that's something that I've learned a little bit. Nicole, can you talk about any specific interview moments that you remember that kind of have stuck with you?
Yeah, I mean, we always talk about like knowing what we're covering, knowing what we're doing, or knowing, that press release or how it's going to affect our communities. Let's be honest, sometimes we don't understand really what they're saying. For example, sometimes there's new executive orders that go in our state, but they don't have a lot of information. So when you're doing an interview, it's valid to not understand what's being asked for or what's being placed on the table. That's where you're supposed to question people and say, hey, but what does this rule or how does this apply to this certain community? Or why is this only happening in this area of our city? Or why is this only happening in this school? So sometimes not understanding what things are happening actually help your interview, because odds are if you don't understand what's going on with a new policy or with a new rule, those are some begging questions that our community is going to have in relations to new requirements. Let's just take an example, the pandemic. Why does this school have to use a face mask? Why does this district doesn't have to use or implement the rule of a face mask, what procedures are happening here, or why aren't there any procedures, especially during these times where we want to be safe for our health. Sometimes we have to ask, why aren't we doing these steps? So many of the times, yes, we have to know exactly what's going on, but those are those times where we don't know what's exactly happening or we don't really understand. That's when it goes into the interview and will actually help build your story.
Okay, and it looks like someone has their hand raised. I think Talia. Do you have a
Yeah,
question?
I was just curious as to like what the hardest part for preparing for an interview would be. I know you guys were mentioning you have to make sure you know what you're discussing, but other than that, like knowing who you're talking to, etc.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's interesting because sometimes, like we said, sometimes you're getting your story that day of. So this person, you really have to do your research on them and know what you're talking about. I think something that I've learned over the years in high school, I was like, I need to have written questions down. I need to have a paper of everything I'm saying. But it looks and feels way more comfortable if you kind of get your facts down in your head, know who the key players you're talking about, or the specific points or language of a bill or whatever it may be. Just knowing that in your head makes you look and feel way more confident instead of holding a paper. That's kind of what I did in high school. I would like look down, look back up, but you would find that your source will feel much more confident and comfortable, and you'll feel much more confident and comfortable if you're just looking at them face to face, just having a conversation. So kind of just going into an interviewing, knowing your key facts and what you're talking about, so you kind of don't have to rely on your phone or paper. It just makes you look, makes you look and feel way more confident and comfortable.
Yeah, right with what Faith says, knowing your facts, knowing what's available, and knowing what there is. But something very important you should take in consideration is that when you go to an interview and you have all these facts, this is going on, this person does this, why I'm here, there are some moments where you have to really listen to what the person is, because they might say something very interesting and you just keep rolling with what they just said, because that just may not be in your plans. And that's where, when you start interviewing people, you also start to reflect on yourself. Okay, they just said this, but is my story going to change? Should I change my story? Or should I keep going with the plan I had and this is the information that I need? Ask that as well and save it for something else. So don't lose track of what you already know, but also be open to what other things they're saying. And that's, I think, is the most important thing, to listen to what they're saying. Because you might be thinking, okay, I need to ask them this question. Oh, but I can't forget this and this. And you just might lose something very important that can change your story.
So those were awesome answers. And thank you so much. I'm just going to jump in real quick because I just wanted to, again, apologize if anyone caught us earlier. Cronkite School ended up double booking events. And so I had to just troubleshoot that because I was also the owner of that. But that's a lot of behind the scenes. So thank you so much, both of you, just for jumping in really quickly. And so is some of these questions, forgive me if they might have been repeat from what you just discussed, but there were a couple of things that I was curious about to know, like even personally, and I'm sure some of our viewers might be too. But how do you both prepare for interviews? I mean, between Univision and Cronkite News, they're still newsrooms, but they could be vastly different at the same time. But each journalist in their own way is different too. So do you do any sort of special ritual or like process to prepare for interviews at all?
I personally have my coffee, and that kind of gives me the energy. But regardless if you're a coffee drinker, I really noticed if you're checked out of this story, if you're not into this interview, if you're not really paying attention and giving them the platform that they need to share their voice and tell their story, then they're not going to open up to you. You want to make sure you're very engaged. And I know these days it's hard over Zoom, but just really paying attention to them and giving them their opportunity to say what they need to say. That's very important. And I think interviews go way better if they know you as a reporter. This is not just another story. You're really listening to what they have to say as a source. So really just staying engaged and connecting with them will make them feel more comfortable and will make your interview turn out better if they feel more comfortable to talk to you.
Right. I think, well, from what I've experienced throughout the years, it's obviously very important to be prepared, know your story, and that has to do also being prepared for yourself. So when you go to an interview, I think it's really important to have a contact of information where somebody can reach you, because there's sometimes people that are very shy and it takes them a while to either talk what they want to say, or maybe they have information that you think they're going to be a great main character for your story, but when you go they're very like shut out, they're very quiet, or they don't feel comfortable yet, but you already talked to them for some time, then you said, okay, I really need them for this story I'm working on. So when you go in prepared, always feel like you want to ask them, is there anything that I missed out on? Or is there anything else you'd like to discuss? Because that's again where they can bring another opportunity for different stories. And when you have their contact information, they'll know where to reach you. And the reason I say this, it's because that takes me back when I was in Cronkite. So at Cronkite, you obviously make your reel, you make your package, you get ready for the real world, you go to all these amazing events. But I actually remember making my first business card when I was in Cronkite during Cronkite News, because oftentimes people are saying, oh, what if I have another story idea? That's where you give your contact information. So yes, go prepared to the story, go prepared knowing who you're going to talk to, what information you know, but also prepare yourself. What things you need to have, your gear, which is very important, checking out the camera, the audio, because no interview will be the same. So if you have an audio issue, even if you go back and they give you that time again, those sound bites will never be the same. And I can assure you that. So always be prepared for yourself, your equipment, how they can contact you. And that's, I think, going to make a great interview, because again, there are some things you just can never repeat.
I definitely could agree with that. I'm like, when I hear a soundbite, I'm like, I'm using that in the package. Like you kind of like work it out in your head while you're talking to someone. It looks like we have a couple of other questions. So does it become difficult to keep your personal bias out of an interview? So personally, I think as a journalist in general, your personal viewpoint or bias is not any part of the story or a part of the process at all. Your job is to get both sides, and whether it's both sides or there's three sides or there's multiple sides, you want to inform the audience on what is going on, whatever angle you're trying to pursue. You just want to make sure you can talk to many different sources and getting all sides of the story. And your personal bias is never included in that. You want to make sure that you're letting these people tell their story. You're not telling it for them. You're just helping it, getting it broadcasted out or putting it out on a digital platform. You're just helping put it together. They're the ones telling their story, and you're just helping kind of editing it together, whatever that may be. But it is these sources that are telling their story, not you. So that was one of the questions. And then another question was, who is the most interesting person you've been able to interview? And do you want to start off with that, Nicole?
I'm trying honestly to remember, but I think during this career, you get to experience things obviously you other people won't experience. For example, you get to sometimes cover sporting events or you meet famous people, but the interviews that are going to stick with you, well, at least in my case, aren't the celebrities or aren't the government officials. They're actually people from my community that if it weren't for journalism, I would probably have never met them in my life. There was one story where I reached out to a couple of restaurants because I needed somebody that was an immigrant to this country and I needed their perspective for some political standpoint. But I needed somebody that came from this country. And I didn't know anyone from that country. So I actually called the restaurants which were Salvadorans, and I needed somebody that was like not Mexican because we already had that coverage, or Hispanic. We wanted somebody from a different demographic. So I called all these restaurants until somebody was willing to speak to me. And this person that I interviewed actually said that he had come to this country about 20 years ago with his wife, and he told me all this American story, the American dream. But looking back to it, I would have never interviewed him or talked to him or seen what his struggles were or his experience were if it weren't making all these different calls. So what I'm trying to say is that yes, you're gonna probably see some flashy, cool events and see people, but the stories that I think are going to stick with you are the stories that are within the communities, are the stories that you probably would have never ran to, or if you see them on the street, you would have never thought, wow, that person has gone through a lot. That person doesn't look like they've struggled, or that person doesn't look like everything that they've achieved in so little time and they've done it for their family. So surprisingly, there are amazing people in our community. And I think that journalism really allows us to tap into those stories. So for me, the best experiences or stories are the ones that I meet within the community.
I definitely agree. It's honestly the people, the everyday people, maybe sometimes people with not a huge title or a government official or whatever that may be. It's the people like us who have these unique stories that you would never know unless you ask these questions to them or kind of learn a little bit more about them. So I definitely think those people are the most interesting and heart connecting, and you can definitely like learn so much from a different perspective that we would not be able to have without meeting this person. So I definitely agree with that. We do have a couple other questions. So Jordan asks, how do you guys come up with questions? So personally for me, I think, okay, as an audience member, if I was at home watching this on the news, what would I want to know? What would I still be asking? Did they ever answer this question? Like, what's next? What's coming up in the future? What's happened in the past? I just think if I was watching this at home or reading this at home, what would I want to know as a viewer? So definitely ask those questions. And I think the most important thing to ask, I think I tweeted this one time, at the end of an interview, the very last question we always ask is, do you have anything else you would like to add? Is there anything I maybe haven't asked? Is there anything else you would like to share? And I have gotten some of the best answers from that question. It's very vague, but it kind of gives an open platform for that source to kind of feel like, okay, maybe you didn't ask this, or maybe I didn't think of this till now, but actually, and they'll give you this great, whatever they were feeling, kind of last thought kind of thing. So of course, yes, do your research and make sure your questions are fact-based and making sure you're informing your audience as much as possible. But that last question asking, is there anything else you would like to add? You would see most times it gives your source that freedom to kind of say what they're feeling, that kind of last thought. So that's what I kind of learned about questions.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. It's very simple, and I think it's super important. The one saying, "Do you have anything else to say?" or "Did I miss anything?" or just letting them express themselves if you didn't ask that question, which is completely fine. But I feel that there are some instances where there's breaking news, there are stories that happened that day of, and you have to go to like these press conferences or events. Sometimes there are events from local organizations in regards to either a protest, or sometimes they're trying to push out with the community. And for those type of events or things that you need to cover, how I prepare is obviously brush up on who the organization is. Because you don't want to show up and be like, I'm looking for this event, but then you don't know who you're looking for. And having said that, also sometimes organizations, they have like media people, but you don't really know the contact of who's going to be holding that event or why they're holding that event specifically that day. So brush up on who you're going to interview, the organizations, and also look into who will this affect, because there are a lot of press releases or events that are going on and available to many people. But at the end of the day, we need to know, okay, who is this going to impact? Is it going to impact a single mother? Is this going to impact kids? Is this going to impact families? What areas in our state or what communities are going to be impacted? So I think it's really important to know who it's going to impact with all this work that you're already doing, covering the video, interviewing people, but knowing who it's going to impact is going to help you create those questions and when certain things going to affect, when there's going to be a policy change, or when people need to even get ready, right? For example, let's do super simple construction. There's always construction, but what area is it going to affect? When is it going to start taking place? How long is it going to take place? How will it impact my commute? How will it impact me taking somebody to the store, to the hospital? Are there certain businesses that I won't be able to access? All those type of things really help once you know who's going to impact.
Perfect. So another question is, what are some tips on putting together a story? I always think that when you're interviewing all these different people and you're putting the facts in and trying to make it make sense to someone who's never heard of this story, maybe, you want to make sure that your sources are being well heard. So whatever they have to say, if it's an opinion or a viewpoint, you want to make sure they're saying it and not you. You want to make sure that you're there to kind of guide the story and make it clear, and put the facts in and kind of make it flow, and you're inputting your sources in to kind of say from their standpoint what's happening or whatever that may be. So I think it's super important to always think, maybe there's this viewer who's never heard of this story ever. This is the first time they're hearing of this story, is my story. So you want to make sure it makes sense. I always have multiple people look it over, which I think is very important. It's important to get other opinions, or people looking at your videos or articles or photos, whatever that may be. You just want to make sure that this will go well and will make sense to people once you put it out there. So that's super important. Another question we have too is, is there anything you definitely don't want to ask as an interviewer? Nicole, do you kind of want to take that on?
Definitely not anything personal. I mean, unless they are your main character. For example, when you do a feature piece, and let's say, I always like to come up with these examples, but I'm trying to think like stories that I've done, especially like at Cronkite News when I was getting ready for the work. So when you have like a feature story, or you have somebody to highlight, those are stories like okay to ask, like, hey, how long have you been preparing if you're like a sports person, right? How long have you been training? How long have you been interested in this? What activities do you do? What programs do you do? What advice do you give other people? But then when it comes like asking people that are state officials, or government leads, that's when you really want to hone in on a certain events or why they're hosting events. But definitely catering to what your story is about. Now, Faith mentioned something that's very important, and she talked about revisions. Probably when you're finished with your story, whether it be a written piece or a video piece, anything that will be published on air, on digital, it's going to live forever. You want somebody to go over that content, because sometimes when you have so much information, or they've said so many great things, it's sometimes easy to lose focus of your story. So for you, when you're writing all day and you're editing all day and you're like, all right, the story is great, have somebody review it. Because when they review it, ask them, what do you think the point of the story was? And their point might be different from your point. And if it's way off, then you might want to reconsider and focus your story on. So also ask those questions to yourself. What's the point of this story, or what is it that I'm really trying to hone in on? And ask other people as well. Don't feel bad about asking questions, or even telling your teacher, hey, can you look over this, or tell your other partner or a classmate, because that really will help inevitably what gets published. And that's really important.
Definitely. I mean, when you're talking about what really is the point of the story, I remember as an STN goer going to these conventions, I would go to these sessions, and Ken Stone always had a session. I forget what it's called, but he would watch your stories in front of everyone, and at the end he would go, so what's the story? Like in a sentence, what's the story? And everyone would be sitting there like, I don't really know. Or here's the story, but here's a couple confusing sentences explaining it. So you want to make sure you really have that point where you can just explain, this is a story, this is the point we're talking about today. There's a million different angles you can do probably on any story. So you want to make sure for your story, you know exactly what you're talking about, what you're tuning in on. So that's super, super important. We have another question about what are some of the hard things in filming and other things. So talking about interviewing specifically, Nicole touched on this, but most times when you are a reporter, you are by yourself. It is a one-man band, and that means you're playing photographer and reporter. Or if you're a digital reporter, you're by yourself and you're relying on your notepad or your voice recordings or whatever that may be. So you really have to make sure, even though the stress of this event or these people you've never met before or this story you just learned about today, you really need to make sure everything's working. I mean, every time I've done an interview, I feel like a million times I've looked over to see if I see the red light that it's still recording. You want to make sure you have your headphones in, you can hear them the whole time. If you're a digital reporter, you want to make sure you're voice memoing it, use your iPhone as a tool for you. I mean, you just want to make sure, of course, you're in the heat of the moment. You want to be present with your interviewee, but you want to make sure everything's working because, like Nicole was mentioning, once they say it, they can't really say it again. You need to make sure you get it. So I think that's one of the hard things of being a reporter, or MMJ, which is multimedia journalist, if you guys don't know. But just being by yourself and you're really trying to keep calm, but make sure everything's working and you're staying engaged. So that's one of the tough things about being alone sometimes. Another question we have, do you think asking questions / asking more critical questions gets easier with practice? Nicole, do you want to answer that?
I think that regardless of how far down you are in journalism or the years you have experienced, the events, it doesn't get easier, but you know how to handle things better. And I can say that right off the bat. When I was in Cronkite, I remember when I was doing a package, I think it was one of the first stories that I was doing for Cronkite News. And I had so much information and I was just like, I don't even know where to start. Or I don't like, I have the video, I have the interviews, I already wrote the script out, but I'm not sure. And I remember Heather Dunn, who was my news director. She went very calmly and said, remember, they're just sentences. And as simple as that sounds, it really is just sentences. So it's breaking down the information and making it flow. If you have good video, if you did your job outside in the field, if you know you got your wide, medium, small shot, your close shots, that's going to be very easy to fill out your timeline per se. So it's really important to have those basics down. Do things get easier? Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. But what's important is that you know how to handle things. You know how to handle, okay, I have my video, I have everything done. Okay, I know how to handle my time management. So that's going to be less stressful for me when I get down to write. So I think you learn how to roll with the ball, because sometimes there's 3 breaking news in a day. And you need to know, okay, what's my priority? What do I have? What I don't have? What I can lose? And this is what I need to focus on. So you know how to manage yourself, which is very important. And that can only come with practice. Don't think that when you see somebody on air, like, oh, they've always been that great. I, for a fact, can tell you I've never been perfect right off the bat, and I'm still not perfect. And I think that's just part of your craft that will come with time, that will come with practice. And you yourself are going to start fine-tuning what you need to learn, what you need to hone in. And that's going to make things so much easier with time. But again, I think you need to have down your basics. If you have your basics, then you have a good foundation, and you're just going to keep rolling with things.
And then another question we have is, in the moment while asking questions off the cuff, is it hard to remain unbiased if you are passionate one way or another? So obviously all of us are human, and our job is to be a journalist. Our job is to let them tell their story. If you are telling the story from multiple different perspectives. They're going to tell you their perspective and they're going to tell you their story. So let them tell their story. With your questions, you want to make sure that you are remaining unbiased. I think it's very important to do that as a journalist, to kind of let them tell their story. Most of the times, if you make them feel comfortable, they will talk to you and say what they need to say, and you will get your story done. You want to make sure you're kind of opening up the floor to them rather than asking your questions in a viewpoint stance. You never want to do that. You want to make sure that they're telling their viewpoint and that they would have no idea what your viewpoint would be. You're kind of just there to help them tell their story. Nicole, do you have anything to add off of that?
No, I completely agree. I think that if you see it in a metaphorical way, we're here to either help highlight people's, input, their opinions, their stand views, and we're kind of like the gatekeepers, right? So we help broadcast, we help publish it, we help push out content, but it's up to our audience to make that decision of what's wrong, what's right. We're here obviously to help dig in and understand how it's going to impact our communities, but it's up to our community to realize if it's beneficial for them or if it's not, or hey, we need more of this in a certain way. We need more policies, we need more help, we need more things in our community. So if you're going to mention like bias, some people say, well, biasm is just in who you decide who to interview, which obviously we have to interview somebody, but how we stay clear from that is that we let people say what their standpoint is. Our job is not to add words or, say, oh, this is a beautiful, this is going to be amazing. That's not up to us. It's up to the community to say, oh, this is amazing, this is going to be great. But it's up to how we present it, and how we present it is letting people speak on their behalf in their ways, not up to us. We're just there to cut it up, make it make sense, and then help our community. But it's up to the community if they want to perceive it as good or as bad. And don't get me wrong, there's always going to be backlash. And there's sometimes always comments, there can always be negative comments. But if your job, if your journalism is factual, unbiased, then you're good to go, because there's always going to be negative comments, unfortunately. But that's how you can steer clear of things, letting people speak for themselves.
Another question we have is, so how do you identify your target audience? That's a great question, because you're like, who really is paying attention to this? Most newsrooms are tracking who's watching, where are they watching from, their age demographic, things like that. I always think whenever you're creating a story, anyone in the world can see this story. Anyone in the entire world can see this. So always think that they could be anyone. It could be anyone that you may not expect to see this story, or someone you do expect. To just kind of have that open mind that this needs to be a story that many people can watch, not just a certain group or a certain type of group. It needs to be a story that could be told to a huge audience, because that is who we are telling to as a journalist. You never know where it's going to go. Even as a college student who is working in a college newsroom, we never know where it's going to go. It can get picked up by different outlets and national outlets and worldwide outlets even. So you just want to make sure that you're being conscientious once you're putting together this story, that anyone can see this story in the long run.
Right. And for my case, for example, I work for Univision, which we are a Spanish media outlet. And for us, our audience, sometimes it's a person, or it could be really a person that doesn't know English, right? So let's look into Arizona. We are a border state. There have been so many new policies, new exec orders, and that changes the day-to-day life in our community. But if we don't do our correct journalism approach or reporting in Spanish, then people are outside of the loop. And that's something that happened at the beginning of this pandemic, where there were so many resources from the government or there were new state laws or curfews, but they were in English. So if Spanish media outlets weren't pushing that information or weren't reporting it in Spanish and really telling them, explaining to our community what this means, how this affects you, when these new rules started in effect, the Hispanic audience that only speaks Spanish in Arizona would have been out of the loop. So sometimes there are different media outlets that do have a targeted audience. For us, it's people that speak Spanish. Obviously, if there's bilingual people, I can speak for myself. But let's say, for example, family members, if they didn't know or they didn't read the news or they didn't see it in Spanish, then they would have been out of the loop. And that's like an audience that we really hone in on, people that sometimes don't speak the language, or some of our audience members, they could have come from a different country yesterday. So they need to be up to date when they see our newscast. They need to be up to date when they're seeing our digital content. Because if we don't provide that information, sometimes government officials don't provide it in Spanish, and they are without a doubt out of the loop.
All right. So I think with that last question, I think we're good on time at exactly 5:30. So thank you both so much just for a great conversation. You guys really took it and ran with it. I'm so proud of you guys. So thank you so much again for just being flexible with technical issues and everything, and great tips. Honestly, really great tips. It's good for anybody who wants to be a journalist, and helpful just for anybody in general. If you want to interview and talk to people, it's a nice conversation starter. But anyways, for our viewers who are on here, thank you so much for joining us too. You might have heard about a giveaway that we're doing with the Cronkite School. So I did include a link in the chat for that. And then we also have one more event for tonight too. So if you're able to join us, that event is specifically about developing your brand and using social media for journalism. So if you're going to be on there, I hope to see you. But then otherwise, thank you so much to our panelists, and thank you all so much tonight for joining us too, and hopefully see you next time. So thank you so much, Nicole and Faith. Take care. Nice to meet you too.
Thanks, ladies.
Thank you.